Konferencija artėja į pabaigą, bet ji dar nesibaigė.
Our conference is coming to an end, but it is not yet over. Therefore, I invite you to stay with us because our last presentation that you will hear
prie vieno šiuo metu
is
labiausiai
related to
pripažintų
psychological
metodų
interventions.
pagalbos
And one of the most recognized methods of assisting those who attempted suicide.
Aušrą Stumbrytę,
I would like to give the floor to our colleague Aušra
dirbančią Vilniaus
Stumbrytė.
psichikos
She
sveikatos
is a
centro savižudybių
clinical
prevencijos skyriuje,
therapist,
pasidalinti
psychologist working at VILNIUS City Mental Health Center Suicide Prevention Unit, and she will share her experience. Hello, I am now honored to be the last speaker at today's conference, and I will share my experience about ASSIP, which is Attempted Suicide Short Intervention Program after attempted suicide. I will tell you what can be done in 4 sessions with a client who has attempted suicide, and that outlines the most important details. So after the previous presentation, we will go back to the micro level, to the personal work with the clients. Those who participate, who have been participating in suicide methods and intervention methods from the conferences from the very beginning, you may remember the author of this ASSIP method who had arrived at one of the conferences. So this is a very good opportunity for us to remind you what that is, because we have already accumulated some experience. I will start with the very beginning, what we refer to. The research is quite old, but I wanted to keep close to those authors of the method. What do we know about the individuals who attempted suicide? When they are hospitalized after a suicide attempt, they later die of suicide. And there is a risk of a repeated attempt, in particular, which is particularly high in the first few months, and it stays like that throughout the first year. So the higher the number of suicide attempts, the higher the risk that the attempt will happen again. When the individual is hospitalized, we have the possibility to help the person, but the research has shown that the repeated hospitalizations don't reduce the risk, suicide risk. And we remember the first presentation where it was said that hospitalization in itself is a risk factor. And in general, people who tend to attempt suicide tend to avoid any help. That is, there is a dropout likelihood for those people from the mental health system. And when we have this window of providing help, we may provide specialized interventions that target the suicide process and therefore may be more effective. So this is the structured evidence-based intervention for people who have attempted suicide, focusing on understanding the suicide process, developing safety strategies and therapeutic alliance. In 2016, the author of the method carried out the efficiency research, and the data is inspiring. It says that it reduces the likelihood by 72%, that the likelihood of repeating a suicide attempt in the next 2 years is reduced by 80%. And ASSIP participants spend 72% less time in hospital, And in the ASSIP group, it was observed that clients rated the client-therapist alliance as a stronger alliance. It should also be noted that ASSIP does not replace any other interventions or treatment methods. It's just an additional intervention, additionally to all other treatment that a person can be granted. This method has been applied in Lithuania for 8 years. In Lithuania, in the help center, we have this group. And in 2016, in October, we took the picture when the first ASSIP certificates were issued to us in 2018. Recently, and last year and this year, after a long break, now we trained new groups, and we have more and more certified specialists all over Lithuania, and more importantly in Lithuanian cities and regions. Let us go further. What is ASSIP? ASSIP is based on the theory of action, where a suicide is considered as an action focused on a temporary goal. Suicide may be treated as a separate process, and it can be analyzed separately. It is believed that every person has their own objectives, pursues important and meaningful life or career goals, and their actions are oriented towards re-achieving them. And suicide is an action focused on a temporary goal, for instance, ending suffering in the face of a failure and unbearable psychological pain in the pursuit of meaningful goals and needs. A person is the expert of their own action, and they have to have the competence to tell their own story. And through telling it, they can give sense to its own actions. And when they are telling the story to another person, they get the basis for this strong therapeutic alliance. And when we can formulate, when we are able to formulate the right story and it is heard in the right way by the right listener, we are able to deal with with it more effectively with that experience. So I will tell you about the structure of a SIP. Session 1 is the narrative, interview, and video. We ask the person in their own words to tell their story of how they got to the point of where they attempted suicide. And the listener and the clinicist, first of all, listens without interrupting, and then they try to find out about the story of the existing crisis or the previous stories. They find to reveal the vulnerability areas and triggers. This story is video recorded so that during the second session, together with the client, they could review the story and have the opportunity together with the client and psychologist to reveal the client's suicide crisis. Very often this is an exposure which is quite difficult for the client. So these are like two travelers, two colleagues cooperating and traveling together, the clinicist and the client trying to understand the suicidal crisis and to some extent reliving it, but at the same time looking at it from the side, from a distance, so that the patient is able to understand the most important suicidal mechanisms.
skatinant labiau refleksiją.
And in this way, a reflection of the patient is encouraged. We also see the suicidal crisis from the outside, from the observer side, and this gives the opportunity for a conscious decision. Just like during every short-term structuralized psychotherapy,
Trečioji sesija, mano akimis,
we have the same elements. Session 3 is a climax of the process, the summary of the whole work done previously when the clinicist, together with the client, reads and completes the case report with the client, which was prepared in advance by the therapist, and that they read it in the first person, and they outline the most important needs, goals, sources of vulnerability, and the triggers of events of the patient, and they together create the individualized safety strategies. I believe that this is the description of the crisis territory, and the therapist and the client together looks for ways to navigate within that safely. Session 4 is optional if they feel that they want to go back to the story together with the client to review it with a different perspective, from a different perspective, and to see at what point in time the story can be turned the other way. Another important aspect, which is typical of the ASSIP therapy, research shows that proactive contact with people reduces the risk of suicide. 2 years after the contact, after ASSIP, people are sent out letters and reminded of safety strategies and reminded of the opportunity to contact the specialist. This is what the structure looks like. And I will give now a few examples what we do and what we can give to the client. One important aspect is to clearly see how a suicidal process developed from suicidal ideation to the suicidal conduct, from the trigger to the action. And these are exceptions from extracts from case descriptions. These are not original ones, I just edited them. For instance, after this incident, it was as if my mind switched into another mode. I started thinking about suicide every day. This was compounded by increasing insomnia. At night, I would walk the streets, experience intense anxiety, and ponder and rethink my problems to no avail. I became increasingly aware that I was stuck and had no way out. I felt very lonely. Finally, I had the worst panic attack of my life and realized I had to get out of here and started planning suicide. So here, the warning signs are outlined very clearly, and we see various cognitive, emotional, and physical experiences covering each other, following each other, where a person turns into an immediate status and they want to get out of it. And that's enough. This is what they feel. What is important is that people themselves or their close relatives tend to think that the suicidal crisis starts with this idea. However, it's important to know that the crisis had started a lot earlier, and the steps have to be traced back. Another important thing is that we can help our clients recognize what can harm them most, and to recognize their vulnerability. We try to reveal vulnerability via people's needs when we know what is important for them. And of course, when people speak about their experience, often they speak about the events. What happened and what they experience, which is very important, and we try to help them the significance of those events within the context of their needs, why this has impacted them. For instance, I had learned from my early childhood not to avoid showing my difficulties to anyone, relying only on myself. Then and now seemed like a sign of strength, even though deep down I always wanted support. The hardest part was when I realized I couldn't take care of myself after my divorce, but I felt very ashamed to admit it to anyone. So this is an example. The person experienced the suicidal crisis related to the divorce. But it's very important to pay attention to the fact that probably other events may break the facade of such a strong person and would cause a suicidal crisis and activate the process. When we listen to these stories, I try to see the person's story through a certain model, a certain scheme, and hear it. What are they saying about their vulnerability? What have they learned from their experience? What they believe in when speaking about themselves, the world, and other people? What words can they use? I am listening what they are speaking about, their needs and objectives, what they want, what they are aspiring for in their lives, what is important for them. I try to recognize what threatens them, what is important and can cause a threat. These are important various external and internal factors, things that can impact them. So the essence is not only the events themselves. People sometimes tend to relate them to themselves, but also the relationship between all those people. And we try to trace back how this was related to this suicidal scheme and how a person was planning that and how the person conducted the action. We try to tell that process as if it were a slowed down movie. The more we are able to trace that back, the more chances we have to intervene and stop that and direct the process in another direction. So the person leaves any intervention with a safety plan, because then we know the person's vulnerability and the needs. The safety plan has its own structure, a very nice format. This is the suicidal crisis reminder leaflet, which can fold in 3 parts and can be carried out in the person's purse, for instance, a wallet. So we look for the resources which in the long term could reduce the person's vulnerability. Here we can see various examples, whether this is the strengthening of the individual's emotional regulation or work with self-esteem or the search for communities. That's very personal. And of course, if the condition is new, how do we recognize it and how do we suspend the more active suicidal process? And how can it be suspended through self-safety actions.
dalį, ar ne, ir šitą dalį.
So we try to
Taip,
target
toks,
both
toliau,
parts
mano
shown on the
žvilgsniu toks
slide.
apibendrinimas apie tai, ką
So
ASSIP
to my
gali
mind,
suteikti
we will
klientams.
summarize
Tai
what
visų
we
pirma, kad
can give
savižudybės
our
krizė
clients.
yra
First of
irgi
all, the suicidal
žmogaus
crisis
istorijos
is part of the
ją
person's
galima
life
pabandyti
story, and
integruoti,
it can be
kad jinai taptų
integrated.
matoma,
It becomes
validi ir būtų
recognized,
galima su
visible,
ja megzti
valid,
santykį.
and
Taip pat
a
labai skatina
relationship can be
įsisąmoninimą,
built
kad
with the
savižudybės
person.
krizės gali
It also
kartotis ir
promotes
stengiamės
awareness that
identifikuoti,
suicidal crisis can
galbūt tai neperžiūrėti
recur, and
optimistiškais, o
uh,
realistiškais.
encourages being
Ir kaip
prepared for them and
sėdant į
encourages being
automobilį
realistic
svarbu
rather than
turėti
overly optimistic.
vaistinėlę, ar ne? Nes
It's
svarbu,
important that the person has a
žmogus
safety
tikriausiai
kit.
nesitiki ir nenori, kad kažkas
The
blogo
person doesn't
nutiktų, bet
expect and
pasiruošti tam
doesn't
būna
want
svarbu, o čia tai
something bad
tikrai
to happen.
tikimybė yra didelė, kad
And
rizika
here, the
kartosis.
likelihood of repeating that
ASSIP yra
risk is
orientuota į
very
to
high.
veiksmo supratimą, jokybę,
ASSIP is
kokį
targeting
skausmą sukelia atsakas,
the
kaip tą veiksmą
action
plėtoti.
and
Ir čia nėra gal
the
kasdieniai
response
žodžiai, kuriuos tenka girdėti iš
and
žmonių,
the
mėginant
origin of
suvaldyti.
this
Bet
action.
tikrai tenka girdėti gal iš to vengimo, gal
I
iš to
have heard
neigimo,
that
tokio nenoro
people say it won't happen
pripažinti,
again,
kad jau man tai tikrai taip daugiau neatsitiks. Ir gal ir nereikia man čia jokių
and
intervencijų,
people
aš tikrai
avoid that this
jau
will never
pasimokiau, tikrai
be
daugiau man taip
repeated, and
nebus.
that's why
Tai jeigu
they don't want any
nepavyksta, tai mes
interventions.
stengiamės pakviesti,
We try to
paskatinti, kad vat, nuo to neigimo, bet
invite
gal po ASSIP
individuals
intervencijos jau
and
išeitų su tokiu žinojimu, kad
to
kažkas
encourage
jį gali
them that
sužeisti,
from
ir
the
su žinojimu, kaip jis gali
denial
sureaguoti, ir su
of
žinojimu, kaip jis
ASSIP
gali bandyti
interventions,
sau padėti.
the person
Kalbant
can
apie
try to
ASSIP
learn to
intervencijos
help
taikymo
themselves.
patirtis
Speaking
Lietuvoje, tikrai
about
negaliu
the
nepaminėti labai
experience of
svarbaus ir
applying
didelio
ASSIP
darbo, kurį
intervention methods, I
suicidologijos
have to
tyrimų centre atliko Jolanta
mention a
Latakienė,
very
rašydama savo
important
daktaro disertaciją
work that
20 metais.
Jolanta
Jinai
Latakienė has
turi dvi
done
pacientų
while
grupės,
writing her
besigydančius
doctoral
ligoninėje po
thesis.
mėginimo
She was
nusižudyti, ir vieni
researching
iš jų
two
gavo
patient groups
gydymą kaip
who were
įprastai, o
hospitalized
kiti
after
gavo
a suicide
gydymą kaip įprastai,
attempt.
plus ASSIP intervenciją
One
ir
group received
kokybiniu
the
būdu
conventional
tyrinėjo jų
assistance and the
patirtis,
others the
tiek
conventional
kaip jie
assistance
patyrė tą
plus
intervenciją,
ASSIP.
atliko ir
And
kiekybinių matavimų.
she
Ir išvados
applied
irgi iš tiesų
also
buvo labai
quantitative and
padrąsinančios
qualitative
ir palaikančios
measurement,
metodą. Jūs
and
galite matyti ir
you
mane gal
see
net šiek tiek nustebino, kad toje ASSIP grupėje sumažėjo
that
minčių intensyvumas.
the
Šiaip ASSIP
suicidal
nieko
ideation
nesako, kad
intensity
kažkaip
has
nieko neapeliuoja į tas
declined
mintis apie
in that group
savižudybę ir
where
nesako, kad
ASSIP
jas
was
kažkaip
applied.
panaikins. Ir žmonės,
Of course,
kuriems
ASSIP doesn't
pristatinėjame ASSIP
doesn't
intervenciją, kviečiame
concentrate
atlikti ją.
on
Labai paprastai manau
suicide.
klausia, o tai kaip man šitas
People
dalykas, kurį vat mes čia padarysim,
were
padės
asking,
nebegalvoti apie
how
savižudybę.
will this
Tai
thing that we will do will
tikriausiai
help me
nepadės,
stop
ar ne,
thinking
bet gal
about the
padės galvoti
suicide?
apie ją kitaip,
Probably it will
su
not help stop
kažkokia
thinking
didesnė
about it, but will
refleksija, didesniu
help
šaltumu, daugiau tokio stebinčio žvilgsnio,
uh,
labiau atpažįstant, kas
take
čia
a
su manim
different view
vyksta, ir galbūt turim daugiau
towards
pasirinkimų.
the feelings
Tai va, tai
experienced,
tikrai
or
ačiū
to,
Jolantai už didelį
helps
darbą, aš tai vėl,
understand
tiesą sakant,
what is
sugrįšiu pačioje
happening
savo
and
pristatymo
the
pabaigoje.
origins
O
of
prieš tai
it.
dar pasidalinsiu keletą
Now
tokių
I will share with
konstatavimų,
you a
pasidalinimų
few
iš tokios visai praktinės ASSIP taikymo
ideas
patirties,
from the practical
kurioje yra taip pat
experience of
psichologiniam
applying a
konsultavimui
SIP,
neįprastų patirčių, ar ne,
where we
turbūt
had unconventional
pajutot, kad ir pavyzdžiui
experience.
viena iš jų yra ta filmavimosi
For
patirtis.
instance, one of the experiences is the
Taip
video
intuicija sako, kad
recording.
žmonės paprastai būna linkę
Intuition
vengti
says
kamerų,
that
ar ne?
people tend to avoid
O čia
cameras,
dargi mes juos kviečiame ne tik, kad
while here
būti
we are
ten, kur yra
inviting
kamera, kur
them
filmuoja, bet dar ir
to be not
kalbėti apie
only where
tokią,
the camera
manau, tikrai
is
sunkiausią
placed,
savo
but
gyvenimo
also
patirtį.
to speak about the
O
most
filmavimas
complicated
turbūt
their life
visiems kažkaip
experience,
siejasi su tam tikru
and
viešumu. Kažkas čia
recording
yra
must be
nesaugaus, ar
related
ne,
to
tai yra
certain
neplanuojama.
publicity
Ir tai
for
yra tikrai
many
labai
people,
dažnas atsisakymo
this is not
nebūtinai
safe for
įvardintas,
them,
bet
and this is a very
nujaučiamas, ar ne, kad
frequent
žmonės nenori tokios
motive why
intervencijos.
people decline
Tai
such
jeigu jums
interventions.
sutinka,
So if
tai
they
mano
agree
akimis čia yra
with the
tokia
intervention,
išankstinė
I think
avansinė
this is an advance
pasitikėjimo išraiška tiek specialistų,
expression
kuris
of
tą siūlo,
trust,
tiek pačiu metodu.
both
Ir tai jau
with the
savaime
specialist
yra,
and the method
man
itself.
atrodo, pradžia stipriam terapiniam alijansui.
And this is a good beginning for a strong therapeutic alliance. It is also worthwhile mentioning that this is not a discussion being video recorded. It's not that the person has to speak to the camera about the suicidal crisis. It's just a conversation between the therapist and the patient. The camera should not be very conspicuous. I'm showing here our original camera. This is related to one of
tos konsultacijos, ar ne, irgi tokios gana neįprastos atrodo, kur mes sėdime su klientu
the
prie kompiuterio ekrano.
sessions by my colleague. These consultations are not conventional. They are not usual for us psychologists either, but I see that this is an empowerment. This is our objective. It's not only myself who is doing something, but the client can also stop the recording, want to add something. We edit the text together. They say what is correct, what is not, what has to be replaced, what is suitable. And being together helps create the objective of the feeling of the common objective.
Vienas labai svarbus momentas atsitinka su klientu skaitant.
What happens to the client when reading out the description text in the first person? Something important happens. I often feel that this is an opportunity for the person to be seen, to feel seen, and that somebody has noticed the person's suffering, the painful feeling for the person, and very often people feel the crisis because they were forgotten, not noticed, there was no response. And this is a very important moment of relationship. So next to the cognitive moment, people realize that a suicide happens not out of the blue. So they can take away something from such a relationship. Another important relationship is writing letters, which we don't normally do. Getting a response to your letter is a rewarding experience when I work with suicidal individuals who are balancing on the life and death limit. We don't know how they live, what is happening to them, and we don't know whether they do live, whether they are still alive. And even after 18 months have passed after applying ASSIP, I have had letters from my former patients who tell us how they live, which is very important. As a rule, when responding to letters, people tell me that there were repeated crises, and they tell me how they applied the agreed strategies, what worked and what didn't. Often they don't reply to my letters at all. Well, I will not speak about the importance of structure. It's just good that we have a very clear structure, and what is clear to both of us, myself and the client, what brings safety. Now, regarding the experience applied, as a clinician has to do a lot to review the video a number of times and to create the story for the client. I don't know why I left the question mark here, because emotional load is much bigger for the therapist than during a normal consultation, because we very often go very deep into the personal crisis and recreate that crisis. That's why the clinicist has to have time before and after the consultation, digest it. And it's always good that there is a team where we can support each other. Well, technology may sometimes fail, and it has happened to me a number of times, even when applying ASSIP, which was a disappointing experience in our creative work. That is, you understand that the recording did not happen, which was a disappointment. Now, in order for the program to continue and develop, everybody needs motivation. Even if we do believe in this method, the internal interest may be not enough because, and we do need more resources, more than for an ordinary consultation session. So the trend is that sometimes motivation may go down. I can actually, I have to tell this. And one more thing, we don't have more research which we could base our experience on. Maybe students of the later years are watching this presentation, and if you have any more experience, please contact us, join us. And now I will go back to Jolanta's research, and I will quote a few respondents who participated in her research. For instance, Caroli says, I was somehow very much hooked by that story when I could read it. That was the most memorable, most vivid moment, the whole description on paper and what it looks like on one page, how I actually came to that crisis, and that impacted me a lot, touched me. Then another quotation is, I would say that maybe the ASSIP program was very helpful to me because I could really identify very clearly the signs that led me to the suicidal crisis. Thank you very much for listening, for staying till late Friday. And this is my literature list. Thank you.
Labai, Aušra, už pasidalinimą.
Thank you, Aušra, for sharing your ideas. I see that there are many thanks and many observations. It was useful to listen to the end. On the one hand, we do not have time, but we do have many questions. So if you are ready to answer, let's do some of them. First question, where and when do we have training for ASSIP? That's a very good question. I cannot answer to this question. The Ministry of Health is curating now this project and I cannot respond. I don't know. The Hygiene Institute perhaps has some information on that. We can follow the information. Have I understood well that the training is obligatory, not recommended, but obligatory?
Taip, tapti ASSIP specialistu
If you
reikia.
want to become an ASSIP specialist, a certified specialist, you have to do the training and participate in a number of supervisions. But if you like the method and some of the details, except video recording, you can just use some of the ideas for your clinical work. Just be inspired by this method. Yes, there are many very interesting and effective principles in this program. Part of the questions were about, or observations were about the effectiveness and the meaningfulness of this method. Specialists, clinicians say that it's not usually very easy to work with people who have attempted suicide.
Gal galėtum taip trumpai
Could
pakomentuoti,
you briefly
kasgi
comment
galbūt padeda tą motivaciją
on
išlaikyti,
your
ar yra
motivation?
kažkokie kriterijai,
Do
kuriais
you
remiantis
maintain
iš
your
visų
motivation?
mėginusių nusižudyti
Do you have any
atrenkami į šią
criteria to
programą?
select the people who have
Padeda
attempted
tą
suicide
motyvaciją
for
ir
this
tą tokį
program?
terapinį ryšį sukurti
How do you
remiantis
find
šią metodiką?
motivation and how do you
Kaip aš
create
sakiau,
the
man atrodo, kad
therapeutic
jeigu
alliance?
žmogus sutinka ASSIP,
Jeigu
tai jis jau,
žmogus sutinka dalyvauti
kaip
ASSIP,
pasakyt,
kaip
jis jau
sakiau,
motyvuotas, ar ne?
if a
Jis
person
jau,
agrees to ASSIP,
jis jau
to
bus
participate
tikriausiai
in ASSIP,
programoje,
as
jis
I
jau
have
kažkaip
said,
pasitiki
he or she
ir
is
sunkiai
motivated.
atsisako. Ir
But
jeigu
there
tikrai,
are people who
tikrai būna
don't want to
nesutinka ir sako, man
participate in
nereikia, tada mes
ASSIP. They say,
bandome
no, I
juos
don't need it.
kitais būdais pakviesti, ar ne, jeigu
We
netaikom
try
ASSIP,
to
tai
invite
jiems
them to
gali
other
šiaip su jumis
interventions.
pabūti,
If
pasikalbėti.
not ASSIP, then just
Man
a
atrodo, kad
talk.
ASSIP pliusas yra, kad labai aišku, kas bus. Čia va
A
to, ko gal
very good
neišsiplėčiau
point in ASSIP is
prezentacijoje.
that it's very
Labai
clear
aišku, kas bus.
how it
Žmogus iš pat
will
pradžių žino,
go
kas jo
on.
laukia ir kai
From the
kad tai truks
start, the
trumpai.
patient knows that what
Tai šitas
he
gali
can,
motyvuoti.
she can expect,
Bet tokia
expect,
konkreti,
and that
aiški
it won't last
struktūra
long.
pagalbos
Yes, the
moteriai.
structure is very clear and it helps.
Pasikviečiam ir mes jam kažkaip galim pasakyti.
When we invite a
ką
person
iš
to
tiesų, ko
participate and we
reikės.
can show them what we will be doing, how
Gal
it will
tada
help.
paskutiniam klausimui
And the last
turime
question,
truputį laiko, tai ar galima pritaikyti ar kažkaip modifikuoti
we
šį metodą pagalbai
modify
nemėginusiems
this
nusižudyti
model
žmonėms, bet
and use it
svarstantiems savižudybę,
for those who
ketinantiems
haven't attempted
nusižudyti?
suicide but
Ar
who
galėtum
have
pakomentuoti apie tai?
suicidal thoughts?
Manau, kad tam tikrus elementus tai tikrai galima
I think that
pritaikyti.
some of the elements could be used.
Nėra, aišku, tokių modifikacijų sukurtų ASSIPO kaip
There are no
ne,
official
nepamėginimo,
ASSIP
nėra ASSIPO
modifications.
programos ketinantiems
There's
nusižudyti.
no ASSIP program
Gal tam
for
tikrus elementus ir
suicidal
galima
ideation, but I
paimti
think
ir
that some of the
pritaikyti,
elements
ar
could
ne,
be
gal
used,
žmogus gali
could be
papasakot savo
adapted.
istoriją, kaip jam atėjo
A
mintis,
person could
kas
tell
vyko iki tol,
their
kol jam atėjo
history,
mintis, kad jis
what
norėjo
was
nusižudyti. Yra
happening
tų bandymų, ar ne,
before
ir su ta istorija dirbti.
the
Tai manau,
first
kad mes
thoughts
galim
about
čia šiek tiek
suicide. We
labiau
could work
praplėsti,
with
semtis
this part of the
galbūt
story.
elementų.
We could
Bandyti
adapt several
suprast jo
elements
pažeidžiamumą, jo
of
poreikius ir
ASSIP,
suprast, kad
try to understand the
kelia grėsmę.
vulnerability, the needs,
Taip, ASSIPO
etc.
modifikacija kol kas yra tik tai paaugliams sukurta.
There's only one adaptation of ASSIP for teenagers.
Tikrai teikia daug vilties, tai kad palyginus taip neseniai pradėtas taikyti
Interesting that
metodas
a method
Lietuvoje
that
ir
is a very new
smagu
method in
girdėti, kad tos
Lithuania.
patirtis yra tokios gana teigiamos ir kad vyksta
I'm
toliau,
happy
kaip
to hear
suprantu,
that
vis
the
po truputį
experience is
mokymai,
very
tai
positive and training is
tokios naujienos
taking
mūsų
place.
padangiai.
This is
Taip,
good.
ačiū tau tada labai
Thank you
už
very much.
pasidalinimą.